The Halloween Massacre, an original novel by Jeremy Terry. Chapter 7. Lights, Camera, Action. Sally Hardesty pulled her Bronco into the Haddonfield Public Access Television Station's parking lot and found a parking spot near the rear of the lot beside a rusted-out car. She sighed as she took the .44 Magnum and its holster off her belt and stuffed it beneath her seat. She had become accustomed to its comforting weight and felt naked without it. She opened her door and got out into the brisk evening air, shivering against the chill. It certainly didn't get this cold very often in October where she was from. She closed the door, locked it, and made her way between the parked vehicles towards the front of the studio, where a line of people were queued up waiting to go inside. The light from the sheriff's cruisers parked alongside the road and around the perimeter of the building painted them all in hues of blue and red. "Can you believe we are going to see them?" the woman in front of her said to the man beside her. Her cheeks were flushed, her eyes bright. "They'll be so close we can almost touch them." Great, Sally thought. Groupies. She had dealt with her fair share of people like them over the years, men and women obsessed with the darkest side of human nature. Women like her wrote letters to imprisoned murderers, sent risque photos of themselves, and declared their unending love. Some went so far as fantasizing about being the killer's victim. Several had approached Sally on the street or written letters, begging to hear her story, wanting to know just how it felt to be a knife's edge away from eternity. They had no empathy or sympathy, could not look beyond their own need to see that they might be hurting someone else who had already suffered greatly at the hands of their idols. Sally despised them. The line milled forward towards the double set of glass doors at the studio entrance, where two men in cheap-looking suits checked for tickets. Sally reached into her pocket and produced an envelope as she reached the men. The fatter of the two men held out a pudgy hand festooned with gaudy rings. "Ticket, please." "Sure," Sally said, handing him the envelope. The man pulled out two thin sheets of typed paper and read over them quickly before referring to a list of names on his officious partner's clipboard. He smiled as he found her name. "Yes, Miss Hardesty, I'm glad you could make it. Mr. Gerardo will be thrilled to see you." "I'm sure," Sally said, witheringly as she took the envelope and letters back from the man and walked inside. The studio's public lobby was immaculate and much more lavish than she expected from a small-town television operation. A series of lacquered plaques lined the wall behind the receptionist's desk, each with the name of a local business that supported the station. A flustered young woman stood beneath them, directing visitors towards a set of doors on the far side of the room. "Sally!" someone called from her right. She turned to see Axel Gerardo, TV host and insufferable prick, making a beeline towards her. She didn't remember ever giving him permission to call her by her first name. He embraced her like an old friend as they came together, making her skin crawl. His sense of entitlement astounded her. "Mr. Gerardo," she said as she disengaged from him and took a step back. Gerardo gave no indication if he registered the distance that she put between them, his crocodile grin never faltering. "I'm so glad you made it. Are you ready to tell the world your story?" Sally grimaced. "The world already knows my story, and I don't intend to rehash it today." Gerardo's face finally fell, his predatory grin replaced by an expression of petulant rage. He took a breath and managed to get his personable mask back in place. "Miss Hardesty, Sally, I thought we had an arrangement. You were paid for your time." "Yes," Sally said, "we had an arrangement. We agreed that I would attend the taping of your show, and you could tell my story. We agreed that I would sit on the front row, and you could film me there. But I never agreed to be interviewed or to be on stage." "Sally, be reasonable." "It's Miss Hardesty," Sally said, interrupting him. "I have the letter confirming our deal with me. Would you like me to show you?" The last of the wind went out of Gerardo's cells, and the petulant little boy look came back to his face. He turned to look at the crowd gathered around them, considering a verbal tirade, and then thought better of it. He looked back to her. "Then I suppose you aren't interested in the flowers, wine, and chocolates I have for you back in my dressing room. I thought we might spend a little time together after the show." Sally nearly gagged. "I'm not even remotely interested." "Prudish bitch," he muttered, turning and flagging down a freckle-faced intern. "Stewie!" The college-age boy stopped in front of them, looking sheepish. My name is Sean, Mr. Gerardo." "Whatever," the TV host said, dismissing the boy with a wave of his hand. "Please show Miss Hardesty to her seat in the front row." "Sure thing, Mr. Gerardo," Sean the intern said. Gerardo walked away without acknowledging him. "He's a real piece of work," Sally said as she followed Sean through the doors into the studio, where tiered rows of seats rose on either side of a central aisle. Ahead of her, the stage was lit with stark white lights that illuminated 2 orange couches center stage and a heavy red curtain behind them. "He's a brilliant entertainer," Sean said, eager to speak well of his boss. "I guess old Sean knows which side his bread is buttered on," Sally thought with a shake of her head. Sean led her to a seat beside a blonde-haired teenage boy who looked as desperate as she was to be anywhere else beside there. He gripped his armrest with white-knuckled intensity. He noticed her perusal of him as she sat and gave her a small grin. Sally held out her hand to him, and they shook. His palms were sweaty, but Sally did not pull away for fear of hurting the boy. "Hello, my name is Sally. What's your name?" The blonde teenage muttered something unintelligible, cleared his throat, and tried again. I'm Tommy," Sally smiled. "It's nice to meet you, Tommy." Brackett stood beside his cruiser as the last of the show's attendees ambled inside, and the studio's doors were shut. He checked his watch and cursed under his breath. Where was Loomis? A convoy of state police cruisers and his own department's cars turned onto the street, with the prisoner transport sandwiched between. They reached the studio and turned down an alley, headed for the rear entrance with their cargo of devils. He raised his hand to hit something, anything, but froze as he saw the bandages covering his hand already. "Get a hold of yourself before you break something, Brackett," he thought. He glanced at his watch before letting his hand drop limp to his side. Loomis should have been there by now. They were running out of time. Brackett looked up to the huge orange harvest moon rising above the trees and felt like screaming. He had a bad feeling. Chapter 8. Masks and Faces. The house lights dimmed as a red neon sign over the stage flashed on and off, asking the audience for silence. Men and women hissed whispered conversations as they moved to and fro behind the cameras that were now trained on the lone figure stepping out to center stage. It was really happening, and Tommy suddenly felt that he couldn't catch his breath. "What are you doing here? Get up! Run away while there's still time!" But he couldn't run away, couldn't rise or even move. It was as if he were paralyzed by the mere proximity of the shape that haunted his dreams. He had to swallow to keep from puking on the pretty lady sitting beside him. Peppy, banal music began to play over the studio speakers, and the stage lights came up, revealing Axel Gerardo in the flesh. He looked electric as he pranced and waved to the crowd. "Bastard," Sally muttered beside Tommy. "Hello, everybody," Gerardo called, laughing. "Welcome to my show, Gerardo Talks. The show that isn't afraid to give it to you raw. We have a very special episode for you tonight, ladies and gentlemen. Tell me, can a person truly be evil. Not just mentally ill, but evil down to his very core. Let me tell you a story about a man named Peter Kürten, who was also known as the Vampire of Dusseldorf. Peter Kürten was born on May 26, 1883 in Germany to poor parents and grew up in abject poverty. At the age of 5 years old, he tried to drown one of his playmates. He soon began to mutilate and torture animals. He committed his first murder in November 1899 at the age of 16, when he strangled an 18-year-old girl. His next victim was a 9-year-old girl named Kristen Klein. Kürten broke into her home to rob the house and decided to slash her throat on the spur of the moment. Many assaults and murders followed. Kürten beat his victims with a hammer. He strangled them, stabbed them. He sexually abused them and even drank their blood. His reign of terror did not end until his arrest in 1930, after which he was evaluated by 2 different psychologists. Each found him to be sane and competent to stand trial. Kürten was convicted and sentenced to be executed by guillotine on April 22, 1931. The execution was carried out on July 2nd. Kürten's last words were, and I quote, "Tell me, after my head is chopped off, will I still be able to hear, at least for a moment, the sound of my own blood gushing from the stump of my neck? That would be the pleasure to end all pleasure." Was Peter Kürten misdiagnosed? Gerardo continued. Was he mentally ill? Was he created by the abusive environment he was raised in? Or was he simply born bad? History is full of wicked people who have done unspeakable things just like him. Take, for example, the Sawney Bean clan from 16th century Scotland. Highwaymen who robbed, murdered, and cannibalized countless victims, if legend is to be believed. Or what about Countess Elizabeth Bathory, who is thought to have murdered over 600 young women in order to bathe in their blood? What about Pedro Lopez, who is known to have raped and murdered over 300 children in Colombia, Peru, and Ecuador during the 1960s, 70s, and 1980? How about close to home? What about Jason Voorhees, the Camp Blood Killer? What about Frederick Krueger, the Springwood Slasher? H. Holmes, Ed Gein, Theodore Bundy? Gerardo paused for dramatic effect, the audience hanging on his every word. Even Tommy found himself drawn in by the man in spite of himself. He had to give it to him. He was a good showman. "Tonight," Gerardo said, "I want to pose a question. Nature versus nurture. What creates a killer? What drives a person to the most sinister acts? We have 2 of America's most infamous mass murderers backstage, and some of their surviving victims are with us in the studio audience. We will hear from some of them in a few minutes. Our first guest comes to us from the great state of Texas. He was raised by an abusive family of psychotics who taught him from an early age that the life he lived was normal. Worse, the family made him butcher the bodies of their victims like they were cattle and store the remains until his older brother cooked them. Yes, he and his family were cannibals living in modern-day America. You all know and fear him. Here he is, Jedediah Sawyer Leatherface. Suddenly, the studio was filled with the harsh sound of a revving chainsaw. Screams erupted around Tommy as a large man dressed in a dirty apron charged on stage with a large metal mallet in one hand and the chainsaw in the other. He wore a hideous mask like the skinned and tanned face of a dark-haired woman on his head. The man rushed towards Gerardo and then turned to the audience. He bowed with a flourish, removing the mask to reveal a handsome young man with a huge grin on his face. Laughter erupted around the room as everyone realized they had been pranked. Tommy shook his head in disgust. He was not laughing, and neither was Sally. She looked ready to leap on stage and tear the two men limb from limb. "Forgive me for my little joke," Gerardo said, as another two men carried a folding table into the center of the stage and walked away. The fake Leatherface set the mask, chainsaw, and mallet on the table before following them into the eaves. Gerardo turned towards the rear of the stage and raised a hand. "Ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, I give you the real Leatherface." The curtain at the back rose, revealing a shadowed recess. There was a loud click as a spotlight was turned on and trained towards the left side where a shoddy-looking cage stood between two armed sheriff's deputies. A large, ugly man dressed in an inmate's orange jumpsuit was chained inside. He blinked, shielding his eyes with his big hands as he stared around. Then he saw Sally. Leatherface slowly lowered his hands and leaned forward against his cage, staring at her with recognition, and Sally stared back. Tommy saw the man's mouth form unheard words. "I think he just said pretty girl," Tommy thought. Gerardo waited for the applause to die down and then turned to face the crowd. "Frightening, isn't he? Was this monster nurtured to be the beast he became, or would he have turned out to be the same regardless?" Our next guest story is very different. He was raised in a loving home, never suffering abuse, and given everything a boy could wish for. He seemed perfectly normal until Halloween night in 1963. That night, the 6-year-old boy snuck upstairs and murdered his older sister with a butcher's knife. Gerardo reached beneath his blazer and pulled out a gleaming butcher's knife to show the crowd. The studio lights glinted off the steel blade like stars. Tommy felt cold in the pit of his roiling stomach. There was nothing left of the little boy by the time his parents arrived home to find him standing with the murder weapon in his right hand and warm, sticky blood on his costume, Gerardo said. The boy never spoke another word. What happened? Was there some secret abuse that has never come to the light? Some event that shaped a 6-year-old boy into a cold-blooded killer? Or is it like his psychologist says? Is there nothing left inside of him but pure evil? Gerardo reached under his jacket once more and drew out a pale mask that was very familiar to every resident of Haddonfield. He held it out for the audience to see. "It's the boogeyman's face," Tommy thought. "Oh God, it's his face." Gerardo waved the hand, holding the knife to the dark right side of the stage. "Here he is, Haddonfield, the ghost that has haunted your peaceful streets for years, Michael Myers." No one clapped or hooted this time as another spotlight popped into life, illuminating a second set of deputies surrounding another cage. The man inside was thinner than Leatherface, but still large and powerful looking for all of that. He stared at the television host with eyes the color of coal. He had seen the knife and the mask. Black stars burst at the edges of Tommy's vision, and he realized he was on the verge of passing out. One thought kept repeating in his mind. "It's him! It's him!" Storm clouds seemed to form behind Michael's eyes. He flexed his muscles, and Tommy heard a loud pop as the chains securing Michael to the cage came apart. "No, this isn't happening," Tommy thought, terror bringing the world back into stark focus. But it was. Michael took a step forward and kicked the cage's door, knocking it free of its hinges. The two deputies were far too slow. Michael took each's head in his hands and rammed them together, shattering their skulls. Gerardo saw this and dropped the mask and knife as he turned to run. Michael stopped to pick them up and donned the mask. He was whole again. No more than 10 seconds had passed. Tommy couldn't look away from his nightmares come true, but Sally certainly could. She stared in shock as Leatherface, spurred on by Michael's actions, repeated them. He flexed, breaking his bonds and kicking the cage door open. He stepped up to the two deputies that were guarding his cage. They had their back to him as they raised their pistols in Michael's direction. Leatherface smashed their heads together as they went down in a heap. He stepped up to the two deputies that were guarding his cage. They had their back to him as they raised their pistols in Michael's direction. Leatherface smashed their heads together and they went down in a heap. He stepped to the table and picked up the mallet and chainsaw. He paused for the briefest of moments and then donned the fake Leatherface mask. It wasn't quite right, but it would do until he could make a better one. Thus armed, he turned, and the two killers studied each other for a moment. Then they turned as one to face the stunned crowd. That's when the screaming started. Chapter 9. Massacre. Everything was chaos. People ran towards the lobby doors, pushing instead of pulling. Those in the front realized their mistake, but were helpless to do anything to correct it, as others behind them surged forward, smashing them against the doors and each other. Helpless deputies pushed back against the other side of the doors, unable to move the massive weight. People tripped and were trampled underneath the crowd's feet. Panic kills people, Sally thought, as she watched the two monsters step off the stage and begin to carve their way through screaming people. Leatherface locked eyes on her as Michael stared daggers at the trembling boy beside her. She reached instinctively for the .44 Magnum and felt only her hip. The gun was outside in her Bronco, virtually 1,000,000 miles away. She grabbed the boy and pulled him along behind her. Not toward the front lobby, but toward the emergency exit door to the side of the stage. Two deputies burst through the door as she reached it, their guns drawn. Sally didn't slow down. She turned to her right and fled along a long corridor past offices where curious people were just figuring out that something was wrong. She came to a set of doors at the end of the hallway and ran through, out into the rear parking lot. More deputies and state police were coming around the edges of the building, their radios staticky. Explosions, garbled voices drowning each other out. "Myers and Sawyer are loose. People are being trampled to death. They're killing everyone. All available units, get inside." Sally ran along the rear of the building and towards the revolving blue and red lights of the sheriff's cars. She thought she heard the grinding shriek of the chainsaw buzzing to life inside the studio and felt her blood run cold. All those people, she thought. Oh, Jesus. Gunshots rang out, the bullets missing their intended marks but finding unfortunate others. 3 members of the crowd fell bleeding, one dead before she hit the ground, the other 2 grievously injured. Jed looked and saw Michael turning toward the terrified deputies. His butcher knife raised. They would cause them no more trouble. He turned back and saw another deputy elbowing people aside in his effort to reach him. Jed felt anger surge through him as he saw the man's face. He recognized him. This was the transport deputy that rode with them on the transport bus, the one that called Jed Pussyface. Jed charged forward, his mallet raised. The deputy saw what was coming, tried to flee, and found he was hemmed in by those around him. Jed brought his mallet down on the man's right shoulder, smashing it and his collarbone. The deputy dropped his gun and held his one good hand up as he begged for mercy. Jed hammered the outstretched appendage, breaking the fingers. He raised the mallet again and brought it down on the center of the man's face. He collapsed to the floor, silent now. He would never call anyone a pussyface ever again. Jed turned towards the jammed center aisle that ran between rows of seats to the front doors where the crowd still pushed against each other. To his right, he saw Michael slash one deputy's throat and ram his knife into the other's sternum, lifting him off the ground with one powerful arm. He cocked his head to one side, and then the other, as the man's blood dripped down onto his orange jumpsuit and upturned mask. Jed put his mallet in his jumpsuit as he mounted the stairs. He cranked the chainsaw into life and closed the distance between himself and the bunched-up crowd. The ones in the back saw him coming and ran to the side, down the nearest row of seats. They were the lucky few. Jed brought the chainsaw around sideways, sawing into the torsos of the gathered crowd. Blood and viscera flew, coating the walls and floor, Jed and the crowd. 5 people collapsed to the floor, their bodies cut in half at the waist. Jed brought the saw back, and then back again. Outside the door, the deputies took a step back in horror as gallons of blood ran beneath the door to pull in the lobby at their booted feet. 15, 20 people bifurcated. The door was finally clear. Jed yanked the door open, caught sight of the stunned and sickened state police officers standing on the other side, and whipped the saw's blade across their necks. They fell back, their heads held on by strips of sinew and gristle. Jed stood over them, watching them gush crimson, and then glanced up to the studio's front doors. Distant shapes milled around outside. He couldn't go that way. He turned left towards another set of doors and came out into a long corridor. Pale faces peeked out of offices as he ran past towards the back of the building. A deputy that looked barely old enough to be out of high school came through the door at the end of the hall, saw Jed, and ran back the way he'd come. Jed followed him through the door out into the cold night air. The deputy was a shadow fading into the dark around the building's corner. He would bring more cops with their guns. Jed didn't have much time. He jogged across the parking lot towards a line of trees, headed north. The Sheik dropped his arm, letting the skewered deputy fall at his feet beside his dead partner. Behind him, the other had sawed his way through the crowd and ran out the front door. The Sheik looked around for the blond boy, for Tommy, and didn't see him. The woman had rushed him from the room. The Sheik turned to the doors they'd fled through and saw the television show's host cringing in the shadows at the edge of the stage. He moved towards the man, his bloody knife raised. He swung it down over and over again, slashing the man's upturned face until it was unrecognizable, until his punctured eyes oozed white, vitriol fluid down his flayed cheeks. "You took my face," the Sheik thought. "Now I've taken yours." He turned from the squilling, writhing man and walked through the doors that Tommy and the woman had ran through. He turned right and strode up the corridor past staring faces, headed for the back door. He passed an office door, caught movement from the corner of his eye, and looked to see a fat, balding man in a suit running at him with a metal hole puncher raised above his head. He brought the makeshift weapon down. He was slow and weak. The Sheik sidestepped the attack easily, waited for the man to stumble off balance, and then stabbed him in the back of the neck, severing his spine. The fat man fell on his face, paralyzed from the neck down, and began the agonizing process of suffocating to death. A door slammed open, and hurried footsteps echoed along the hall. The shape stepped to the office door, poised to strike. A shadow played on the opposite wall, and a state police officer came into view. Michael struck, opening the woman's throat from ear to ear. She tripped and fell, clutching at her bubbling throat. The shape longed to watch her bleed, but he had more important prey to find: Tommy. The boy that got away from him thanks to his sister and Dr. Loomis. The boy was so close, he would not escape him again. The shape strode to the back door out into the parking lot. There was no sign of Tommy or the woman. Still, a voice whispered that they were close. He would find them soon enough. He turned left and walked towards an alley and neighborhood beyond. After all the long years spent patiently waiting, he was dormant no longer. The shape had come home again. Okay, Slash-a-Holics, this has been chapters 7, 8, and 9 of the Halloween Massacre by Jeremy Terry. And what a ride these chapters were. They flew by. I'm just glad Jeremy's not the kind of author that really drags things out. And I like to be that kind of author too, that just throws you into the action. You know, gives you what story that you necessarily need to set things up, but then throws you into the action and doesn't let up until the end. And I feel like that's what Jeremy's going to do here. And I never doubted for a second that Michael and Leatherface were going to stay in those cages very long at all. I didn't expect them to get out that quickly, but it was a good unexpected. Like, it really just kind of kicked the story into hyperdrive. You know, the host really built all this up, and I thought he was going to kind of, take his time, messing with the cages and stuff, pissing off the killers. But no, Michael and Leatherface were ready to be free, and nothing was going to stop them from that. I wonder who could have warned everybody that this type of thing might happen. I don't know, maybe the sheriff, Dr. Loomis, Tommy, Sally, pretty much anybody with a brain. Lots of people just died. That was insane. The chainsaw part reminded me of that Netflix Leatherface movie that came out like 2 years ago or whatever. Whenever he's on the bus just chainsawing people. But I think it was more entertaining in this book than it was in that movie. And it was scarier, more tense here. These people were just... Because we've all been there in a hurry and you like push on a pull door or pull on a push door. But yeah. Great stuff with, Leatherface putting on this fake mask for now, getting his chainsaw, getting his mallet, getting to get that guy. I knew it was coming. The officer from the bus that called him Pussyface had his face pretty much turned into that, is probably what it looked like, a big old hole in the center. Michael getting his mask back and a blade, just going crazy on these people in this building, and they're both outside. They're both making their way into the darkness, into the shadows, and we can only imagine where things are going to go from here. I love that Sally and Tommy are teamed up now. I can't wait to see them kicking some ass together. And yeah, I'm really enjoying this book so far. And I'll be back very soon with more chapters, as well as very, very soon, more chapters of Murder Report. I had another problem where I recorded a narration of Murder Report, had it ready to upload tonight, and ended up with a corrupt file. So I'm going to have to redo that one. So it would have come out before this. But since that happened, I went ahead and got this finished and edited and out to all of you Slash-a-Holics tonight. So I hope you enjoyed it. Let me and Jeremy know in the comment section or the chat if you're watching the live version, the premiere, what you thought of tonight's chapters, if you're enjoying the book so far, and maybe throw out some predictions of things to come. If you haven't done so already, please subscribe to the channel, hit the like button, drop a comment, and now you can become a channel member. There's 3 tiers of the channel membership. You'll get early access, you'll get videos that only members can see each week, and there's emojis just for members, stuff like that. Check it out. Link is in the description and pinned comments, as well as the Patreon Cameo, and ways that you can donate to the channel, like with single-time donations, PayPal, Cash App, whatever. All of this helps the channel continue to keep going and growing for years to come, and we really appreciate you. So until next time, this has been your friendly neighborhood 80s slasher librarian saying, thanks for listening, be excellent to each other, and we'll see you soon.